Welcome, everyone. This is the Loud Sound Epicenter podcast. I'm your host, Aaron, as always. Today, we're going to be talking about the 1970s. Last week, we talked about the 60s. And if you haven't watched last week's episode, I highly recommend checking it out because I think if you were around during that time, you could attest to it. And I know that's a bold statement because I am Generation Z. All the episodes are from a Generation Z perspective. That's our theme on the show. And I think even if you're watching this video and you'd like to recommend it to somebody who is older than me, I think you'll find that there will be a surprising amount of overlap despite the age gap. And so I would just once again would like to plug last week a look back at the 1960s and sort of a retrospect into how to look at the decade and all the genres that make it up. So after going through the 60s, it gave us a great opportunity to apply a similar review of the 70s. And there is no shortage of ways to go about doing it. I think if you asked your average person, your average layman, to define or sum up the 70s, they would probably narrow it down to disco and soft rock. And in terms of music sales, they would definitely be right. However, I'd like to pitch or provide my own angle into reconstructing the false dichotomy between progressive rock and punk. And we'll also go through the pros and cons of each genre and show that there's really a common cause between the two genres and that the things that differ them are far and few in between compared to the things that unite them. And so we're going to be going through their strong suits as well as their weak points. And so yeah, we'll be we'll be going through the rise and fall of progressive rock and sort of counter that with the reaction by punk, which was taking notice of what was happening during the decade and what it was becoming, and sort of the response to the organ solos and the suites and so on. So that'll be the show. We're going to present these genres from this time in their proper context, because if you've ever seen a documentary about this decade or any of the genres I've listed so far, you'll find that there is a lot of critique between the two. There's a lot of pitting the genres against each other. And, it becomes a little boring after a while. I know at the time, I wasn't there, of course. But looking back, I think there's a lot of insight that we can learn from all the fake rivalries or rivalries that don't really matter. So, for instance, Prog bands were antagonized for the extended solos, and to be fair, I think the extended solos, specifically the organ solos, I think it does date the music. Now, not to minimize it or say that it isn't talented, because there's definitely a technical quality to it. I just think that it does latch on to the decade, and you can definitely pinpoint it. And I think that's a problem because the sound or the statement of progressive rock should be timeless, like a lot of the prog bands are. And then compare that to punk, you could say that it is definitely amateur by comparison. And critics and journalists often said that it was not accessible to mainstream audiences. It was not fit for public consumption. And, well, you can be the judge of that. So this is the dichotomy, supposedly. And at first glance, it does kind of fit because you have the prog bands representing the musicianship and longevity versus the punk bands, who were kind of representing the short and fast style, along with the aggressive side of music. And full disclosure, I like both, so I'd like to extend an olive branch to both sides. And I'd like to bring up the fact that they were both smeared by the critics, and that leads into the main case. The main purpose of this video is to say that there should be an alliance between prog and punk, not so much division, because there is a lot of common ground that doesn't really get talked about. And one of them being that they were both excluded by gatekeepers of the music industry. We're going to get into gatekeeping in our next week's episode about the 80s. And we'll save that for next week, okay? We're going to get into that. There's a lot of content. And I'd like to give a shout out, not that he needs it from me, but there's a great video by Sia Tranquility, Pete Pardo, talking about the state of classic rock radio. And it basically sums up my take, and that's what will be most, if not all, of the ground we'll cover with the 80s. But I think this gatekeeping, and I don't know exactly where it starts. I'd like some viewers to maybe try and pinpoint it through their own research. But in the 70s is when I really start to notice, after the prog bands had their freedom by the record labels, there was a sort of restrictive element to what was acceptable on the radio. And even though punk and prog are very different musically, the fact that they are both up against the music labels and having to face force-fed the soft rock and disco diet, I think this is common ground for both genres. And so now, of course, prog bands did have an advantage of getting on the radio. However, I think it's important to remember that I think a lot of it was in spite of the fact that they were prog. In fact, they had to strip down their prog roots to even make it on the radio. To take Rush, for example, the songs that made it on the radio were Closer to the Heart, and later on, Tom Sawyer, which I think the real reason that song's on the radio is the keyboards, not so much the prog side of it. So I think that's worth keeping in mind, and it's food for thought. And by contrast, you had, no shortage of epic songs, prog anthems, like Magnum Opus by Kansas, was not getting played on the radio. It was Carry On Wayward Son. And so right there, you start to see the distinction between what makes it on the radio and why. There is definitely a formula, but certain formulas are not on the airwaves. So that's something to bear in mind. Now, with punk. Now, obviously, the only bands from the punk scene, to take CBGB's, for example, that were able to make it into the mainstream were the new wave bands. Like Blondie's a great example of a band that got rid of its punk roots, and they succeeded because of it. And I like those albums, but listeners can tell that as a band, they were moving into the commercial sound, and they got rewarded because of it. They were not rewarded when they were married to their punk roots. And so I think that's a little telling to see that you had all these bands in the CBGB scene, and the ones that made it were the Talking Heads. Well, I mean, the Talking Heads, I put them, they're in their own category. I don't know exactly what other band I'd compare them to, so they're kind of an outlier within their own scene. But you know what I mean with Blondie. When did they become popular? Was it when they were on their first two albums, or was it when you started to hear some familiar stuff in their sound? So that's worth thinking about. And also, I want to get into the pros and cons of this alleged dichotomy between prog and punk. Now, it is true that prog bands are overproduced, and one of the polarizing aspects of the genre is their dedication to precision and taking it very seriously, almost mathematically. And reverting it to something like opera or classical music, I think, is more comparable than to compare it to like the soft rock that was on the radio around the same time. Now, although I do kind of think that the punk bands instigated the dichotomy, they kind of forced it between prog and punk, and that's one of the places where they lose me, because the punk bands do kind of, even though they are a reactionary movement, they do kind of force other genres into rivalries, I think. And that's, the rebellion attitude of punk is definitely an element of that. But I think it's very unnecessary when certain genres feud, because there's easily enough room for coexisting genres to do their own thing and thrive on their own merits. So that's my take on that. And one of the things that punk took pride in that I think was a detriment was their lack of technical talent. And for any genre, this is not sustainable. And the example that I have is the Slits. The thing about the Slits and bands like that is other bands are going to mimic it. So even though I like the Slits, not everyone can be the Slits. It's lightning in a bottle. So having bands like that around and within the genre that does not pride itself on technical skill, it's invariably going to end towards movements like the no wave movement, which is way too exclusive and not accessible to anybody outside of it. And so that's where, the punk and prog groups, they're exclusive in their own camps. And that's where they have their shortcomings that I'll get into later on. Compare that to prog bands. There are plenty of easy listening bands for casual fans, with bands like King Crimson, and I have here Pink Floyd, who sort of paved the way for a lot of the bands that came after, groups like Kansas and Rush, who kept it going. And then by the mid-70s, you have a lot of these bands at their peaks, like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Yes, etc. And there's even I think there's a quote from Robert Fripp who said something along the lines of, by the mid-70s, progressive music was not progressive. There was nothing to build on top of it. So it ceased to become progressive. And to tell you the truth, I didn't verify that quote. I did check out a book called Rocking the Classics. And that went into detail about how the progressive era became excessive and overindulgent and basically became obsolete before the end of the 70s. And maybe that speaks to why albums like Love Beach exists. I'm not going to get into that, but for those that know, maybe that kind of speaks to where things like that come from. And one of the main downsides to prog, of course, is the detours that they're doing during their songs. And an album like Tales from Topographic Oceans, basically serving up punk fans their argument on a silver platter. Like the shortest song is like 18 and a half minutes. There's multiple 20-minute songs back to back. I mean, like, come on. And I also have to defend Prog and say that album obviously doesn't represent the genre. There's plenty of easy listening bands like Genesis, ELP, etc. But for those that say that, prog is a thinking man's music, I think there does need to be some self-restraint encouraged when things like Tales from the Topographic Oceans makes its way. And isn't that like their second album? So it's like, or no. That's their sixth album, excuse me. But again, it's the early 70s, and you have to imagine what like a casual fan, like I can't recommend that to somebody, you know what I mean? It's just there does have to be a little bit of marketing, a little bit of accessibility, besides just going full on prog, if you know what I mean. So now for the punk side. And I think they do make some good points. And mainly when it comes to the radio that they had to listen to. And it hasn't really improved since the 70s, in my opinion, because they were forced to listen to bands like Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles back to back, and that's exactly what it is now. And so our generation can definitely relate to this struggle that a lot of the punk bands were enduring. I know this was way before, but bands like, or albums like Made in Japan basically sum it up. And by the late 70s, a lot of that extended solos was really played out. And honestly, it was pretentious, I think. And maybe even fans of that stuff can agree as well. Yet, I do have to bring up the common ground between prog and punk, because even though that it's the long songs versus the short songs, it's basically the same cause. because these are two formulas that are not going to make their way into the mainstream. And so they are stepping outside the box and going beyond what the radio will approve of. And so in that way, they are kind of like in the same unit, if that makes sense. And even though punks don't want to listen to Rick Wakeman solos, I still think they are united against the overplayed soft rock. And it's another overlap between the two genres. And okay, this is probably the best case that's on the punk side and the best argument against the 70s era in general. Punk took away the idolatry treatment that bands like Zeppelin were getting. And if you know what I mean, I think you'll understand. There was this divide between the band and the fans. And this is something that I really gravitated towards when the punk bands would talk about this stuff. Not so much the punk bands as far as sound, but their critique of the other genres. So to me, the best aspect of punk was getting rid of this mystique that the soft rock bands or the arena rock bands were elevating themselves to. And the perfect example is The Clash. From their first album to their third album, there was a big change, and it was after they became commercial. It was after they became successful. And, you know, I to bring it back to the prog bands, I like bands that overthink everything, and they're doing, like I said, the organ solos and the suites and all of that. I do like it, but it is asking a lot to recommend albums like Tarkus. And like give that to an average casual fan. And obviously they are purposefully doing their own thing. They are being exclusive, like the way that they arrange their albums, like Tales from a Topographic Oceans. And that's why I think what prog bands should have stuck with was the Rush formula. To me, I don't even hesitate to recommend Rush for anyone who's interested in prog, because it's got the formula. It's half concept album and half normal. And I just think that way everybody wins. And it's not too polarizing for the casual fans, and the prog fans will be on board too. So I just think that is the perfect entry-level middle ground that the prog fans, if there was ever going to be a concession, it should be in the direction of Rush, I think. Now, by contrast, punk bands not offering a lot of albums, even in their peak, that is a detriment to the genre. And I know that punks who were there would say that that is true to their merits, but yet I think it is counterproductive to not care about the musical legacy, not the corporate legacy that the Clash bought into. What I'm talking about is it would benefit the bands to take a lesson from the prog bands and put a little more effort and attention towards the longevity and have plenty of content for the fans. I think that that's very charitable to say. And like the Ramones is to counter what I said about Rush to the punk fans, they should apply their direction to the Ramones. They survived throughout the decades, mingling with different sounds, but never losing their core sound. And they pulled it off, and they were one and the same with the fans. So for prog, Rush, I think, is where they got to keep their ears tuned. For the punk, I think it's got to be Ramones or maybe the Dictators. Just have some more albums, you know? And I know that, you know, they don't want to have a lot of compilation albums. I know they don't believe in stuff like that. But there should be some consistency as time goes on. I think that's a fair diagnosis of the two genres. So I like punk, but they create a lot of their shortcomings. I like prog, but I think they could have kept their early 70s, mid 70s stride. If there was some restraint, I think it could have helped them. Although it is worth checking out that the albums that came in the late 70s and into the 80s, the bands that kept going, I think there is a lot of substance with those albums. So I definitely would not write those off as, like what Fripp said, there is no more progressive rock. It may not be the classic era, but I think it's definitely worth checking out, and it's definitely worth your time. So that's the 70s. It's a little more optimistic than last week's episode with the 60s. But for those that watched it, it kind of turned into a rant towards the end. I don't know if I was planning on that to happen. I think in the back of my mind I wanted it to happen, but I thought it was kind of cool that it went in that direction. So I would definitely recommend checking it out. Once again, it was a little unscripted towards the end. But there are mutuals, or there should be mutuals between Prog and Punk. They have a common cause, and they should both go up against Stevie Nicks and Don Henley. It's enough. It's enough with Rumors. It's enough with the Fleetwood Mac self-titled album, the second self-titled album. Throw some Leftoverture in there. Throw some, an underrated Rush track. Throw that on the radio. Disc jockeys. All right. So yeah, that's the 70s. And honestly, I don't know if I should say this. I think one of the reasons why the 70s, this episode was a little more optimistic, is because a lot of the bands in the 70s had a lot more talent compared to the 60s. I think there was more to work with. Now, I don't want to polarize people that are older than me. They're going to tell me that, of course I think that. I don't understand folk rock. I don't understand Janis Joplin and Bob Dylan. I don't understand it. You had to be there. And maybe that's so. But I do cling towards the 70s. I think there's a lot of genres from that time that kind of get unnoticed. And I think if we bridge the gap between punk and prog, I think that's a great conversation to have between those two often antagonizing groups that can find common ground against the journalists, the critics, what the media was saying about them, having to listen to the same radio that I had to listen to growing up and getting used to the same songs. So yeah. So that's the show. A little less ranty. Now, while I have you here, if you're still watching, you're one of the lucky ones. There will be a documentary on HBO, and it's perfect, the timing of this with this show and all the episodes, starting at towards the end of last month and throughout this month. There will be a documentary called Woodstock 99, Peace, Love, and Rage. And the way it's going to be talking about the decadence and how it's very different from Woodstock in 1969. I should have used that as an example in last week's episode. That would have been perfect. So that documentary is going to go up after I do the 80s episode. And then it'll be perfect because by the time I watch it, I'll do a review separately because this series is going to go up to the 90s. And it's going to end with after this documentary comes out. And it'll be a perfect segue into the 90s episode where we'll address Woodstock 99. And there is so much content to cover with the 90s, so I don't even know where to begin, to be honest. So definitely stay tuned for that. Stay tuned for the review. It's going to be separate from this series that this is basically turned into, going through the decades, reviewing them. So that's the plan. That's the show moving forward. And hope you enjoyed it. Next week, we're talking about the 80s, as I alluded to earlier. It's going to be about the gatekeeping. It's going to be along the lines of what I said tonight. There will be some parallels between the radio stations, what they just kept force-feeding people, and a lot of the genres that got propped up, leaving behind a lot of the underrated stuff. So that'll be interesting. But thank you again. That is the show. That is the Loud Sound Epicenter podcast. Thank you for watching. As always, I want to hear your feedback. Am I just some Gen Z know-it-all, or am I a Gen Z know nothing. Just tell me what you think about the 70s, overrated, underrated. Did punk get a fair shake? Was Prog too pretentious? Were the critics right? I want to hear what you guys think. Let me know what you thought. I'll be more than happy to look at your feedback. I want to hear more from you guys. You guys are the reason why I keep the series going. And so thank you again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. And have a great rest of your day.